Hey folks, my name is Matthew Weiss, and today I'm going to be filling in for David Nazi on Mixbus TV. If you've been following the channel, you may be aware that Bella has had a pretty serious issue. She is in the hospital and in recovery. The good news is that things are starting to look more positive than they were even a few days ago. But that said, this is a very serious issue. It was looking like maybe even life or death for a moment. So obviously David is going to be attending that, and his focus will be there. So bear with me as I cover for him and fill in on this channel, and please continue to watch the channel because I know that sometimes we don't think of it this way, but YouTube becomes a job, and if you do not show up for work, regardless of the circumstances, that can cause financial repercussions. It can hurt the channel. So bear with me while I do my part here and fill in. All right. So in this episode, I would like to talk about snare layering. David did an incredible video on snare layering about a year ago. He took a snare that already sounded good and he just made it sound amazing. I would like to do the same thing. However, I'm going to be doing it through my context and my lens, so it's going to be a little bit different than what he did. And basically, this will give you guys the opportunity to watch that video, watch this video, and compare and contrast and say, okay, Matt's doing this, I like that. David's doing this, I really like this. So I'm going to sort of approach it like this, and you create your own system for your own personality and the things that you like. So, 2 engineers, price of 1. Okay, let's pop on in here and do the most important part of any mixing procedure, and that is listen.
Caddy music.
Okay, so that is the snare in the context of the record. Pretty much untreated. There's a little bit of treatment. I did a little tiny bit of phase alignment on the multiple snare mics, but that is just a raw live acoustic recorded snare, and it sounds really good. And that's an important consideration when we're looking at our layering because it's going to dictate some of the choices that we're going to make down the line. So let's solo this up real quick, and we can give it a listen. So before I do my layering, I like to do a little bit of loose or light treatment on the primary snare, just so I can kind of understand what I'm centering everything around. In this case, I think it's going to be really simple. I'm going to make the determination whether or not I want to gate the snare. Now, sometimes we do not want to heavily gate or even gate the snare at all because the bleed contributes to the glue of the drum kit. This is going to be true in a lot of styles like jazz, indie rock, classic rock. Sometimes it just sounds good even if it's not like a genre thing. So we don't always want to be hard gating or heavily gating our drums. But in this case, because of the nature of the music, I do want something that feels a little bit more tight and focused and clean, and so I am going to be gating the snare, and I'm going to be using the Sound Radix drum leveler. This is my go-to gate because it determines things based off of sample rather than amplitude, although amplitude is a contributor to how it's set, and let me just play it real quick. Pretty darn good sounding gate. Okay, now, once I've got that going on, in general, I like the sound of the snare. So how am I going to do my layering? Do I even want to do layering? I think in this case I do want to do a little bit of layering, but let me explain the thought process because I think the thought process is much more important than what I'm actually about to do. So in my thought process, I'm breaking a snare down into its components. And in my mind, that's going to be the attack of the snare, which is the snap, the brighter tones, the personality / tone texture of the snare, which is going to be mostly in the mid-range, but also some of the upper range because some of the bands contribute to the texture and things like that. And then the weight of the snare, which is just how heavy it feels in the record. So with those 3 components in mind, I can kind of say, all right, do I need to reinforce anything? How's the personality? Does it need a little bit more flavor? How's the attack? Does it need to be a little sharper? How's the weight? Does it need a little bit more body? You know, I ask myself those questions, and if the answer to any of them is yes, that's when I start doing my layering. I'm not just layering willy-nilly. So I do feel that this snare could use a little bit of pop to it. I think that it could use a little bit of texture, and it could use a little bit of snap, like snare band type of snap. So let's listen to it again in context, and I think you'll see what I mean. It's good, but it feels like it's all sort of living in the mid-range. It's got like this, it's almost like a rim shot kind of snare, like right toward the edge of the snare drum, like right in between what would be like a snare and a rim shot, I guess. So having a little bit more band, having a little bit more tone, I think is going to help. In terms of the weight, I'm like 50-50. We could add in another snare for weight, or we could just add some low end. We kind of have to play that one by ear. But let's start by talking about how we're going to pick our layers here. So I'm going to play this layer by itself so you can hear what I picked. It's actually 2 layers coming together. All right, so this is what I'm going with. Now, the way I do it is I go through, I play the music, and as I'm playing the music without the snare in there, I start hitting my different, auditioning my different possible snares, whether it's vintage drum machines or whatever it is. So if I'm looking for it, I might go through, I'm playing the record, I'm like, oh, this sounds cool, and this is not even a snare, this is a clap, but I like the way it sounded in the context of the record. So I'll go through, I'll select a few and be like, okay, this sounded cool, this sounded cool, this sounded cool, this sounded cool. Then I bring in the actual snare itself. I turn the level down significantly to where approximately I think that the ultimate level is going to end up on for the layer, and then I play it in the context of the record to see how it all comes together. And that's how I whittle down my selection to what I like. So let's go through that process real quick. Let's put these back up. That one's not bad. Also not bad. That one's almost like the previous one, but a little tighter sounding. There's something very compelling about the texture of that. It's still a little too exaggerated in my mind, but there is something really, really interesting about it. So it's adding a bit of personality and flavor that I really like. And this is entirely subjective. You know, it's based on, I'm acting kind of like a mini producer when I do this. So in my opinion, I like that one. And then here's a drum machine snare. And I really like that one because it brings the snare sound very forward and makes it very bright, but at the same time, it sounds pretty blended right to begin with. So I like these two, and typically I only use one snare for this layer, but today is the exception. I'm actually going to use both together. So once I've got that figured out, then I listen to it in context with only the snare. And I like the way that it sounds, but it is a little bit too mid-forward. It feels like it's covering up the main snare, which I do want to talk about that in a second. But if I pull out some of those mids and then maybe even brighten it up a little bit, it's going to kind of sculpt around the main snare a bit better. So let's pull that in. Alright, that's way better. One of the things that you got to be careful about when it comes to layering is how it interacts with your primary snare. So the way that I think about it is this. The producer and the engineer and the drummer picked a snare sound for a reason. If I do my layering right, then the personality of the snare should be retained. It should still be what that snare was. Because when I send this back to them, I don't want them to feel like I've changed their vision. I want them to feel like I've augmented their vision. I've taken what they had and I've reinforced it. So if I make that primary snare the main personality and I make sure that none of my layers are actually covering up that personality, then they're going to be pretty happy with what I send them. As opposed to if I somehow like make it hard to identify the tone and texture of the original snare, that's when I'm going to start getting pushback. So I've picked that out. I ultimately decided not to go with a low snare. I felt like it was not that necessary. Then I commit my triggers. So I've printed this now onto a track, and I've done a little bit of phase alignment, a little bit of transient alignment. So I've moved it back minus 33 samples, just so it hits a little bit tighter. Sometimes this doesn't make much of a difference. Sometimes it really does. In this case, it made a very slight difference. And then also a little bit of EQ. This is supposed to be brightening things up. There was a little bit more fundamental tone that I didn't feel was necessary. So my end result ultimately sounds like this. That's my layer. Now, let's bring in the snare. Without. With. So it adds a lot of pop, it adds some tone, some texture, a little bit of snap, all of those good things that we are listening for. So now let's play it all together. Without. With. So again, I'm not taking away the personality of the snare. I'm retaining it. You hear it very clearly. It just feels like I'm adding some snare band sound in there. I'm making it a little bit more textural, basically. Okay, so then we get down to the snare all. I combine all of my layers, and this is where I'm going to try to make them feel like one snare doing one thing, one idea. So here I'm going to brighten the snare up quite a bit. I'm also going to add in a bit of that weight. I'm doing it with an EQ instead of using a layer. Sometimes an EQ works better, sometimes a layer works better. You just kind of got to go with what you feel. Okay, so starting to get a little loud here. I'm going to lower the level a bit. Then there is the shape of the snare. The shape of the snare can vary quite a bit. When we're doing rock records, a lot of the times we want a really punchy, attack-driven snare. So to do that, we can use a compressor. Here I'm using a PWM style compressor. This is the VNE from Mixwave, which is a really cool compressor. And I'm using a pretty slow attack and a pretty slow release. What this is going to do is it's going to actually act like a transient decider. It's going to allow a lot of the attack through, but it's actually going to choke off some of the sustain because my threshold is pretty low. So let me jump in here and solo everything and give you a before and after. So you hear it actually gets attackier. We lose body, and that's because of the attack and release settings. But you also notice that it starts to sound more like a single snare drum, which I think is an important idea. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this mix knob because while it is good to have that punch, first of all, this record's not a rock record exactly. It's more like a funk rock tune. So I might want to find a different blend. Second, just regardless of genre, I may want to find a different blend. And the other thing is, in order for a snare to really like stay present in a mix, we do need sustain. Sustain is actually going to help it more than attack probably will. So we're going to basically use this mix knob to reconcile genre, the amount of punch we want, and the amount of sustain we want all at the same time. Pretty good to me. That feels like we're in the right zone. Okay, last ingredient here is going to be clipping. Clipping can be a very strong double-edged sword. On the one hand, you can get a lot more body and presence in a drum by clipping it, and drums typically tolerate clipping better than other elements, especially melodic elements. However, you can also really squash the attack out using a clipper. So we kind of have to negotiate things. What I will say is that on close mics, I'm a big fan of heavy clipping because we still get a lot of the attack and the dimension and the tone and the sense of dimensionality from the overheads and room, right? We've got other things that aren't the close mic that are contributing to the sound. Typically, we don't worry about whether or not the close mic sounds perfect. It's really more how it's performing in the mix. So you can be a little more heavy-handed with clipping in general. Now, this is a little more focused on the close mic, so we have to be thoughtful about it, but let's get some clipping in there and see what we come up with. So this is giving me what, according to this meter, is about 13 dB of clipping, and you can hear the attack starting to get smushed. But that said, 13 dB is quite a bit. Like, if we check our meter here, if I just boost this way, oh, where's our, there we go. If I just pull this meter way into focus, I mean, that's a huge level difference compared to tapping into the orange. So, I mean, honestly, the reason I like orange clip is because you can just do an astronomical amount of clipping and it still kind of holds the sound up. I think we have gone too far, though, so let's start backing things off. I mean, I feel like we're in a pretty good zone right there. Let's do a little bit of level makeup. Seems like the average was about 6 dB of clipping across. So now we can bring that into the mix, and we might actually have too big of a snare, which is not a bad problem to have. Our snare is actually now too big for the record, right? We've accomplished our goals so well that we've overshot. So now what we can do is we can back off this clipping, we can pull the snare down, and we can find a sweet spot where the snare sounds like it's the right size for the overall vibe. So I think if we pull off maybe a couple dB of clipping, so let's try something around here. Actually, I think I want to push a little bit more clipping without necessarily doing the level makeup gain because I just like the sound of it. I think it sounds good. Yeah, let's pull off one one hair level. But once there's heavy clipping involved or heavy compression involved, little subtle differences end up being much more noticeable. So these little half dB differences that I'm doing that I normally wouldn't notice, here they kind of stand out. So okay, that puts the whole equation together. So it's a little bit of a convoluted process, but the thought process is actually pretty straightforward if we really break it down. So to sum it up, the idea here is I want the main snare that was recorded to be the main snare. I want to retain that personality and that sensibility. Then I'm going to use my layers to either add weight or attack, or maybe a little bit of texture, or something that's going to help that personality along and make it feel bolder in the record. Once I've picked my layers, I then contour the layers with some EQ, some phase manipulation, whatever, to best suit the snare and get out of the way of the main snare. And then I combine it all. I take the snare and the snare layers and I combine them all to one track, where I then start to bring the whole sound together as if it was all one snare. And that's what we end up getting. Now, I'm going to bypass this layer, and without the layer, it sounds like this. With the layer, like this. And what we notice is that the snare personality hasn't really changed, but it does feel more forward. It feels a little bit more textured. It feels a little bit more interesting and unique. And that's ultimately what I'm typically going for when I'm layering snares. So I hope that you dig this video. Thank you guys for watching. Stay tuned. I don't know how long I'll be filling in for Nozzi, if other people are going to fill in, if it's just going to be me, or what the story is going to be. But I'm going to be in contact with him. He's going to be in contact with you guys. And thank you so much for staying supportive during what is a really difficult time. Yeah, stay tuned, like this, hit subscribe, and bear with me while I'm hosting. Bye.